me try to make it even bigger. Perfect. Cool. So hello, everyone. I'm Keta. I am a coach here at Leland. And today we're talking all about MBA admissions, applications, and how to create a holistic one. I will give you a little agenda. I'll wait one more minute to allow a few more people to join. If you can put your cameras on, I love cameras on because I can see how I'm doing. But if not, understandable too. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started in the name of time. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Then we'll talk through 3 really key questions. Okay. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay. Now you can. All right. So for agenda for the day, I'll tell you who I am, why I'm a coach. Then we'll go through some key questions you need to ask yourself as you prepare your application. And then I'll leave some time for open Q&A where you can ask any questions that we haven't covered. Does that sound good for everyone? Awesome. Okay. So as I said, I'm Keta. I currently sit in New York. I'm from Ohio. I'm a coach here at Leland. I went to Dartmouth College for undergrad. I went to Harvard for business school. While at business school, I did a consulting internship, early stage venture capital internship, had a startup, work at a startup now, so very much in that startup ecosystem space. But I was a non-traditional applicant for business schools since I worked at Kraft and Carnival Cruise Line before applying to Harvard. So I would say my sweet spot as a coach is really working with people who have non-traditional backgrounds and bringing out your story to make it shine. I do have a little discount code here, but I think I'll show it again at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead into the first big question. So why? Somebody still can't hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Cool. So the first question that I want us to talk through is, why does a holistic application matter? I think some of you might think about, the stats like test scores, other pieces of the application where you're like, people told me my GMAT needs to be really good. Yes, that's true. But a lot of people have a lot of stats, right? And at the end of the day, what's going to be memorable for an admissions committee is your story. They want a whole human, not just a statistic, because there are lots of qualified applicants, just like for a job. And the difference between qualified and the right person for the job is often about telling your story so that the committee gets to know you. All right. So the 3 questions your application must answer no matter what school you're applying to is, who are you? What are your goals? And how will you reach those goals? This should be your North Star. Each piece of your application should help to answer one of these 3 questions. The number 1 mistake I see as a coach is that people think of the application only as, the personal essay, when in reality, it's so much more, right? You have short answers, you have recommendations, you have your resume, and you have your personal statement. So the personal statement is just one piece of the puzzle. All of the rest of the pieces should still be doing the job of helping the admissions committee learn about you. So I want everyone to grab a pencil or a pen and a paper. I'm going to walk you through a little exercise. I like my sessions to be informative and helpful. So we're going to make you actually do something. So talking about this first question of what drives me, it really is that identifying what motivates you is key to understanding where you see yourself in the future and kind of why. So I want everyone to grab a pencil and paper. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, but I'll first give you an example of this short exercise. So a way to think about what drives you is when somebody asks, why do you work so long in the office? Why are you always at the gym? Why do you come back and volunteer? Like, what is your answer, right? For example, I was coaching a grad school application, and the applicant's goal wasn't the program, right? That wasn't her end goal. It was what she was able to do after the program and the tools that she would learn in the program. That was really important for her. What drove her was being able to accomplish a certain thing, and the program was just a way to do that. Another example is I was volunteering with somebody at a soup kitchen. He's a gastroenterologist, and for him, again, being a doctor is part of the holistic piece of helping people. That's why he volunteers, because nutrition is important to overall health, right? And so that, again, drives him. So I want us to take 30 seconds and take your time to write down when somebody asks you why you're working so hard or why you do what you do, what is your answer? Go ahead and write. Doesn't have to be perfect, just jot down some thoughts. All right, any thoughts that anyone wants to share? You can share them in the chat. If not, that's okay, but I hope you at least wrote down a few thoughts. Part of the application process is getting your thoughts on paper. They do not need to be perfect to start out with. They rarely are, but getting started is often really difficult. So just writing a few thoughts is a good place to start. All right, I'm going to move on now to the second question. So the second question is, how am I different, right? Based on your experiences, what specific perspective are you able to provide? This is really important because business schools don't want a class full of everyone being the same, right? But there are so many different ways. You can't hear me, Sophia. I think that people are able, I can take out it any better. Can everyone still hear me without my headphones? Okay. Oh, right. So this question is important because, like I said, business schools want a diverse group of people. They don't want everyone in the classroom to have the same answer and the same thought process all the time, right? Like, imagine how boring that would be. I think what typically stumps people on this question is you think, well, if I came from banking or consulting, or I came from an industry that so many people came from, how am I any different? If I'm in the majority, how am I any different? And I think this is where I invite a lot of the people I work with to take a step back and think about all the things that make you you. For example, is faith really important to you? Did you grow up with parents speaking a different language? Did your parents not go to college? Do you have a weird hobby? Sound is worse. All right. We're struggling, but I'm trying to work with you all. Okay, I'll put the headphones back in. So the how am I different question is really important to be able to answer in your own way. So for this exercise, if you asked either a colleague or a friend, what would they say you're really good at, or what makes you quirky? Or is there anything when you're talking through your background with people that surprises them? An example that I use on my, for myself is I worked for Kraft Foods and Carnival Cruise Line. I knew that my experience in the cruise industry, working with people from all over the world, was different than most of my classmates, right? From compliments during promotions that I got at work, I knew that I was unusually good at delivering a vision and making it happen. I also knew that my upbringing in a small town in Ohio with an immigrant mother would provide me with a different and unusual lens to see things through. And so the idea here is not to pick the one way that you're different, but begin to think about the ways that your path maybe zigged, where other people's zagged. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to try to write down some thoughts to this short exercise. All right, I'm going to go quiet, 30 seconds. Okay, any questions or thoughts or things that came to mind when you were thinking through this? Feel free to put them in the chat and I can answer. Okay, so first question is, my major is materials sciences and engineering, but I joined as a consultant, which was different than my classmates. Exactly. So again, that's a way where you're like, I'm a consultant and that's the majority of what people do, but I am different because of my pathway there. Can you speak? Jeff, is that you?
Yeah. Hi, Keta. Thanks so much for doing this today. Something that came up to me while I was trying to do the exercise was I was thinking of like my multicultural background. I'm half Chinese. I also was in a Spanish immersion language program all through elementary school. And so like these are things that influence how I think about the world, a kind of a global perspective that I bring. But then I'm thinking like, well, HBS is like 40% international. Like, what's the point of me saying like I have a multicultural background that obviously influences how I see the world and choices I've made in terms of like, okay, like, community service trips when I was a teenager to like, utilize the language, studying Chinese in college, and continuing that kind of global perspective. But then again, if you look at these M7 schools, it's like everyone is multicultural. So it's like,
yeah, I think that's a really good question. And to your point, it's thinking about you started to get at it, how it's affected your perspective, right? Because identity is only a piece of the how am I different diversity thought, right? Like all of these schools are going to have stats. They want certain people with test scores. They want people with certain backgrounds. But like you said, maybe it's that your mom having this perspective as a certain type of cultural figure, right, made you want to work really hard at everything, or maybe it took you to a breaking point because you were working hard at everything, not thinking about what was important to you. And so there was a time where you had a reckoning with yourself and you realized what's actually important to me and where do I want to put all my energy and effort. So I think there are a lot of ways where this is just, again, like getting the juices flowing of what are the different ways that I'm, what are the ways that I'm different or unique, or where most people around me are not the same as me. But to your point, that's where a lot of the work comes in with the coach and with you, is saying, okay, I have these things that are technically different about my identity or maybe the path I've taken, but it's the so what of it all, right? And I think that's what we start to work through when we do coaching. I have this huge questionnaire that's a lot of work to fill out, but a lot of what it gets at is like, okay, so you have this perspective. How did it change your perspective at work now? Like, what do you think is different about your perspective from having these study abroad or these volunteer abroad experiences? Did it not really change your perspective and you only realize that now as an adult, you did all of these things, but you still don't feel in touch with your identity, right? Like there are so many ways that you can go with that. So again, this is just starting to like tease out the small ways that we could start to take your story. But I think to your point, no one thing about your identity is going to be enough to rest on for any of these business schools, especially these M7 schools. So it really is thinking about how it's changed your perspective and maybe the opportunities you've chosen or the opportunities you've had, rather than just kind of how it makes you you. Does that make sense? Cool. Let me see. So I think to your point, Joe or Joseph, first generation American who went to film school, worked in TV and commercial production, looking to go into media finance, very specific, right? That is very different than most people going into business school. So again, it's thinking about how your perspective and your experience there, what gaps did you realize you had in your experience and knowledge that makes you want to get an MBA? Like what questions did you start to ask that made you realize that maybe an MBA is a place to get answers to all of those questions? That would be a good place for you to start. So let's move on. So many knowledge gaps. I mean, everyone has knowledge gaps, whether they think so or not. The accountants do too, trust me. So we'll move on to the third question. And really it's, what do I want the admissions committee to take away, right? If someone got to know me only by reading my application, which is only a few pieces of paper, even though it's a lot of hours of work, do they reach the conclusion that I want them to, right? People like stories that are easy to remember. Think about maybe your favorite character in a TV show or in your favorite book, right? It's not just like how good the acting is or how many vocab words an author uses. It's the story that really captures your attention. And I think the same is true for admissions. You need to create an application that reads like a book. And this is true for your essay, but also your recommendations, your interests, and more. And everything should help to tell the same story. So for the short exercise, the idea here, which is hard, is if there's one thing you would want me or an admissions committee to remember about you, what is it and why? For example, for a client I coach, I explained to her that it's easy to remember one thing about a person, right? She wanted to go into beauty after her MBA, which was unusual. So she told everyone, anything related to beauty, that's me. That's what I want you to remember about me. Somebody who is interested in beauty. She probably has so many other things that are important about her, but that is the one thing that she wanted people to take away from her application, from her story, and from her time at HBS. And so we created a lot of her application to focus on what brought her to this idea that she's interested in beauty, even though she didn't do beauty before. Why does it make sense that she wants to go into it now? And how is that, how is her upbringing and everything she was interested in culminated in this moment, this idea that she is beauty and beauty is her, right? It's way easier to remember that one friend that does something funny or says something funny than somebody you met who was perfectly nice, but told you a whole bunch of different things about themselves. So again, here, the short exercise is to think about what is that one thing that you would want me to remember about you and why? So I'll give you 30 seconds to write that down. All right. So I'll give you one more example for a client that I recently worked with, and then I'll ask you to put in your chat what you are thinking about or any questions you have. So I had a client this season, decent test scores, not fantastic, unusual background, military background, applied to a lot of top 20 schools. And when it came down to it, the one thing through all of his questionnaire work, all of the deep digging and soul searching we did, what it came down to was he wanted to be remembered for selfless service. And that was that, right? Like he did a lot of things in his career. He had a lot of different roles. Faith was really important to him. He likes to give back, all of these things. But what it came down to was selfless service and leadership. And that's what he wants to be remembered for. So there are so many things that you're going to talk about in your application, but they all kind of need to tie into like one of 3 points, ideally 1 point. And so for him, that's what we realized really encapsulated everything he's done and a lot of the choices he's made. Any questions? Let me see in this chat. Is something like inclusivity or PEVC too broad or overused? Yes, too broad. There will be an opportunity to talk about the kind of what you want to do, like going into private equity or venture capital or, being in DEI. But I think overall, that's not memorable enough, right? If a certain percentage of people in your class are going to go into that, what about that is specific to you? So it's maybe that you want to use VC to invest in underserved communities in Latin America. That would be an example of being specific enough. That, though, is a goal, rather than just what we want to remember about you? Because does that tie into, is the overarching theme really investing in underserved communities overall, and VC and PE is just one way you want to do that, right? Like maybe you want to empower people in certain communities, and VC PE is the way you see that happening because you think financial independence is important. Does that make sense? So like getting more specific around the whys behind it. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so this kind of like, who are you at your core? Do you think that stands separate from or can it be separate from like the kind of like career, short-term, long-term goals, or do they have to connect? Because that's like the struggle of like your example of the gentleman who like selfless service. Then but let's say he's trying to say that he wants to go into management consulting. Like, how does that work? Or like, let's say,
that's a good question. Yeah. So I think this is part of why you work with a coach. It's like a lot to untangle everything about you, right? Like there's so many pieces of you, and probably going into business school, like so many things you're interested in, like that's totally okay. But from the perspective of admissions, having a clear story that makes sense is really important. So for example, for this client of mine, he wants to probably go into a finance rotational program because he wants to continue to lead and manage others. He just wants to do it in a different way in the private sector, essentially. But although his short-term goal doesn't exactly line up with selfless service, it still does, because he wants to be able to manage people, but he just wants to do it in a different place. And managing people takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work, and he's going to apply his perspective on leadership and management, plus whatever he learns in school, to his new career path. So as long as it's not at odds with that, it's fine. But again, how would I say this? Let me see. So what you want people to remember about you doesn't have to be your short-term career path, but it should align with your long-term vision of where you see yourself in life. Does that help? So it doesn't have to make like A plus B equals C, like 1 + 1 = 2, but it can't be like 1 + 1 = 1 million. It has to make sense where, maybe let me take an example from the chat. Energy optimization through solar energy implementation. Yeah, so that's a great goal. That could be the one thing you want people to remember about you, but maybe it's creating innovative solutions in markets that don't have them. And maybe right now your plan for that is this energy implementation, but it doesn't have to be your long-term goal of what you want to do with all of your life. That might be one stage of it, but maybe it's the general thinking behind all of that is that you want to bring innovative, cost-effective solutions to communities that need them. And maybe the goal that even is one step back from that is you want to make a difference through cheap alternatives to what exists today, right? And maybe one step back is you want your job to be something that fulfills you. So, and helps others at the same time. So I think there's kind of like a cascading of priorities, and your one thing that admissions is going to remember about you doesn't have to be your long and short-term goal, but it should be able to tie into it where we see how it could make sense. It can't be something so distinct where you're like, I want to impact the financial wellness of everyone, but I also want to go into a hedge fund, right? Like that doesn't make sense. If you want to do that, that's fine. And maybe you're going to tell me the convoluted way where you want to do that. I have nothing wrong with hedge fund bros, but again, that would be more confusing, right? Like those two things don't align. So maybe that isn't the thing that you want people to remember about you. And maybe it's that you want to make big sweeping changes that affect the landscape of finance and infrastructure. And then working at a hedge fund could make sense for that, right? So that's how I would start to think about it. Again, this isn't going to be your be all end all for your application. It's just questions to start to think about and to consider and flesh out, because the whole application process really is a lot of soul searching.
So on that note, Keta, so this kind of what you want them to take away from you, obviously it'll be different for everyone. So, but for some individuals, it could be a character trait, and for others, it could be a much more career specific ambition. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Either or.
Exactly. Either or. And sometimes it depends on how specific you are on what you want to get out of your MBA and the exact career that you want to go into. Some people know that they want to do this one thing with their MBA. Some people are more open to the idea of doing one of 4 things. So to your point, it really could be different for each person. And that's why it's helpful to work with a coach and kind of do this questionnaire process, which is a lot longer than this session of like asking you brain dump of all of these things about you, all of your experiences, so that we could try to find things that tie together, right? Try to make a story and then try to figure out what within that story is going to be the most impactful kind of takeaway that we can focus your whole application around. Cool. And no shade to hedge fund bros. Sorry, Alexander. Just using that as an example. Cool. So let's move on. Oh, sorry. There we go. Move on to a little recap before we do some Q&A. So I would say the application process is long. It's a bit tedious. It's emotional. It's difficult, right? Like it's all of these things. Deciding to go back to school and taking another test for it is a lot of work. But because it is, I recommend that you put in the best effort that you can. And when in doubt, remember these 3 kind of, golden rules. 1, telling a story really, really matters. You could be the person with the best GRE, GMAT score, fantastic work experience, and you didn't tell a story around that. And so you're not interesting. Second, the application is the sum of its parts, right? Often we think about the test score and the personal statement as the only pieces of the application. That is not true. Your recommendations are really, really important and an opportunity for people to tell a story about you that, again, ties in with your overall theme. Your resume should be a place where you can tell a story. The short answer questions are also a place where you can tell a story. So it really is the sum of its parts. And then third is that everyone has a unique story to tell. If it feels like it hasn't come across yet, you just have to keep going. A coach can be incredibly helpful, whether it's me or somebody else on this platform, to navigate the admissions process because it is complicated and time consuming. And a coach can help you tease out your story. We can keep you on track and we can help you put your best foot and your best application forward. Okay, with that said, here for any open questions you might have. Nothing is too stupid or small or big. I'm happy to tackle it all if you're willing to share in front of others. Go ahead, Joey.
Hey, thank you for hosting this session. Super informative. One thing I wanted to ask is, I'm considering working with a coach just because of how informative these sessions have been. Do you have advice on when to actually go through with that? Like, is it better early on? Is it better like toward the middle of the application process when I have a better understanding of like where I'm coming from? Because I could see both. I could see it being super helpful in like getting the story framed and set earlier on, but I could also see it being useful like once I have a better idea of like some of the core things that I'm looking to highlight.
It's a good question. And I think it's what's your willingness to work with a coach. I think coaches, so for example, I've had a variety of clients, some who didn't have an idea of what schools they even wanted to target. And so part of the work we did is like, what are you looking for out of an MBA program? Are you willing to move? Are you willing to live in certain cities, right? So we did that whole work of like creating the target school list and then starting to work on their story, having the test scores in place, all of that. Other students are like, hey, these are my top 3 schools, and I really, really want to make a good application for these. Can you help me? And again, we'll start normally at the teasing out the story piece. A lot of coaches like myself will also help with like reviews or interview kind of mock interview pieces, but I would say where you get the most value from the coach is if they help you tease out your story, because like that is so much work. There's so many hours that go in on the back end of the coaching side, like one on your side preparing this, but two on the back end of the coaching side, reading and reorganizing and kind of pulling out themes that I think that if you have the capacity, starting to work with a coach earlier rather than later is helpful, just because if you're applying to more than one school, it's a lot of work. You're still probably working full time. And having a bit more time is always better, not like a year in advance, but 3 months in advance. It's round 2 coming up now. So if you want a coach to help you in the kind of end of it all, now would be a time crunch. But again, if you're thinking further out, kind of in that 5-month period before you're planning to apply, gives you a lot of time to, 1, assess the coach, 2, create a plan together and feel like you're not going to be scrambling at the very end when applications are due.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. Okay. So Sophia, I see your question is suggestions for deferred MBA applicants who don't have a lot of experience outside of undergrad. So are you saying like a 2+2 program?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. So I assume that now you're in like your junior years or potentially senior year and you're thinking about which schools have deferred application programs, right?
I would say more so in terms of how to frame an experience. I think that something that I'm struggling with a little bit more is just being younger, being 21, 22 years old compared to other applicants who are more in their mid-20s, have a lot more experience. How would you recommend for an applicant like me how to frame their story?
That's a good question. And I think it's not to compare yourself with people who are older, right? Like schools have the deferred application programs for a reason. They're looking to get a variety of people, some who are the more traditional age range, some who they're like, we want to get these people early on so they come back to our program. And I think for you, it's thinking a lot about how you've been involved in school and maybe how that involvement has been different from most other students. So it could look like the fact that you're very involved in 2 extracurriculars. Are you the leader of any of these extracurriculars? Do you have a professor you're really close with? If not, get close with one because you're going to need them to write a recommendation. Do you have a part-time job on campus? Is that something that not a lot of other people have? Could your supervisor be one of the people who writes your recommendations? What have you learned from having a part-time job, right? So there are a lot of ways to illustrate different components of your experience, even though it's not having had 4 or 5 years of work experience. And then I think the other piece is just intellectual curiosity. That's something that you can speak to that a lot of more traditional non-deferred applicants can't speak to in the same way because we've been working for a few years before we apply. So I would think, what as a student, am I able to do? What is so interesting about what I'm doing now that I can show excitement towards for the future? And then thinking, long and hard thoughts around what exactly you want to get out of an MBA and what you're going to do in those 2 years so that you can come in and contribute to classroom discussions, given that you won't have as many years of experience. And I think that's what could set you apart, is being really thoughtful about that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course. Josh, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all the insights. My question is about maybe people who have more entrepreneurial career goals. So for context, I was a student founder in undergrad, did some tech jobs here and there, took a long break, and I'm just starting to build momentum with internships and think school's the next step. Do you have any advice for people who know they want to do something more entrepreneurial in the future again, but don't have exact clarity on this is the exact thing I want to build next?
Yeah, I think in your case, what will be really important to illustrate in your application is why school is important for you. The number one, I always think of it think of the devil's advocate. So the number one question the admissions committee is going to have is if you already were a student founder, if you worked at startups and you want to go back into startups, why the heck do you need an MBA? Right? That's going to be their first question. There could be very good reasons, and I'm sure there are, for why you want one. And so it's just thinking about how to answer that question. Maybe it's the community you want to build. Maybe you started in tech startups and you want to do startups in a different landscape or a different industry. Maybe it's that you realized when you were doing these startups that there was a gap in your knowledge or in leadership that could have allowed you to be more successful. So I think it's fine to say you don't exactly know what you want to do, but you love small, fast-paced companies, and you want to explore what that looks like. Maybe you want to even find a co-founder at school and leverage all the resources that an HBS has to offer with the iLab, where you're connected to general Harvard schools as well, and with the Rock Center, right? So there are ways to speak to wanting to do something general and not knowing specifically, but I think that's when the school research is really important. So you could speak to the resources that you plan to leverage from those schools and kind of what gaps you're going to plug with school overall that you couldn't just on your own.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Of course. Next question. Let me look in the chat. Okay. Is it great to talk about why you may not have had a not too good college grade? Yes and no. This isn't something that you want to focus a ton of your time on, but you're going to want to explain it in the extenuating circumstances piece of maybe it was that you worked a lot, or maybe you just didn't get the purpose of school, but now you love your work. So that's something you don't want to spend too much time on in your overall application, but often there's a section in the application saying anything else we should know. And that's when you can give a little perspective on maybe why things didn't go your way the first time around, but why you think they'll go better this time. Okay, let me get into the next question. Jeffrey, go ahead, and then I'll take another one from the chat.
Yeah, for those applicants, and again, I'm going to try to make the question applicable to other folks, but for those who are pivoting and are using the MBA to gain new skills, gain exposure to industries that they didn't have exposure to prior, what is your best advice on how to link because my understanding is you need to present kind of where you've been, where you are now, where you're going, and you have to tie a thread between all of these things. So, but let's say your short-term, long-term career goals, it doesn't necessarily seem to connect because where you've been is you're making a pivot. So how do you do you need to be able to connect? How directly must that connection be, or can it literally just can you just be honest and be look, I'm making a change, and maybe you have certain character attributes, or maybe you have leadership, sort of team ability, teamwork skills that you're bringing from a prior background, and you want to translate that to this new area. But what if you don't necessarily have the direct sort of I don't know, almost that the academic experience there, or from an intellectual perspective, is that okay? Making that jump is what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and something that people think about a lot. So how I would put it is it doesn't need to be a direct tie, but it needs to be a this makes sense kind of deal. So say you're a teacher and you work at a nonprofit and you want to go into VC. Let's just say that's a pretty big pivot, right? You might not have the skills, and maybe you want to even go into late stage VC, so private equity, where you need modeling skills, you need a whole ton of hard skills that you don't have. Why do you want to go into private equity, right? Is it because as a teacher you realized you were moving the needle every day with young people, but you want to move the needle in a bigger way because you're going to invest in companies and be shaping the future of the economy, and you figure that has a bigger impact than teaching? Is that why? So you need the why, right? The why. And then the how. Teaching, you're used to corralling people, being a leader, doing all these XYZ things, and you think from research you've done that these personality traits could also be helpful in PE. But why you're also interested in coming to business school is because, one, there are hard skills you need. You plan to accomplish this through the finance and accounting classes, but also there are soft skills you need, and there are things you want to learn. And so you're looking to your classmates to learn from those who have done maybe early stage VC to see if that's a better fit, or if private equity is a better fit. And so I think there's a story that can be told very seamlessly of this is why it makes sense for me to go to school, because otherwise I can't pivot. No private equity firm is going to take me, right? There are no recruiting programs for professionals that are not out of school. And then two, I don't know if I'm going to like it. And being able to have this network of people who have done some of these things is a very great way for me to pressure test my potential interests and make sure that it's what I want to do. So I think that's fine. It doesn't have to tie as, again, it can be a zigzaggy path, but you have to bring them with you every stage of the way so that they understand how you got from A to B if it wasn't just a straight line.
Yeah, gotcha. I mean, that's a big one, but you always hear about like, oh, like a teacher, like, I don't know, like a dancer or something who's like in an MBA program. And, but it seems like that whole trajectory you just kind of teased out there, it hinges on, there's like a why of like when they were teaching, they must have realized that something about how like, the impact, the greater impact they could have in a different space. Is that kind of like the pin that like, do you need to have that in whatever background you have to make the connection though? Because like, what if you don't have that like aha realization moment of something? Do you have to just—
So let's give a different example. So say you came from a certain industry. I have some Snyder's Pretzels. Say you worked for Snyder's Pretzels and you want to go into management consulting. Going into consulting is pretty typical for a lot of people at business school. And you could say that it's largely because you worked at a Snyder's, you got a lot of great experience, but you realize maybe you don't want to be in food forever, or maybe you worked in a specific function in Snyder's and the company is, whatever conglomerate owns Snyder's is so giant that you only see a little perspective of what they do. You want to go into consulting because you want to see lots of different clients. You want to see clients of different sizes. You want to try, doing due diligence. You want to try doing sales, like all these different things. So it doesn't have to be as pie in the sky idea of, to your point, this big why, but there could be very real, reasons that you want to move from a Snyder's to management consulting. Okay, I see one question from Joseph, of course. You know what, we have 1 minute left. So let me try to answer one more question and then I'm always on the platform. Let me just see if here we go. I'll keep this up right now. So I'm always on the platform. You can schedule free intro calls with a coach that you think is interesting to you. So that's a great way to get a better perspective if a coach is going to be right for you. But let me see. You can definitely do a big career jump in an MBA. It takes work and networking, but possible, very possible. I've seen it happen a lot. Recommendation letters. You cannot use a coach. You worked at his company for a short period of time. It depends. That's something that you would need to spend more time with your coach talking through if it makes sense to use that person as a recommender or not. Just because oftentimes schools want to see your direct managers, a current one and a former one, as your recommenders. And if you choose otherwise, you just want to be pretty clear on the reason for that. And then I'll answer these last two and then we'll wrap up. All right. So currently an Air Force officer, electronics engineer, experience in supply chain, strong passion in business and finance, looking to change direction. That is like the name of the game for a lot of the military people. That path is tried and true, has been done before. So it might seem crazy to you now, but not too crazy for those of you who are doing an MBA and applying. That would be a really good story. And we could talk about experiences that you got from the Air Force, things you liked and didn't like about it, and kind of why you're choosing to make the transition now. It can either be for a business reason or a personal reason or both. And then last question, when you're an entrepreneur, you don't have managers to write a recommendation letter. You have clients. Yes, you'll need to work with clients to get recommendation letters. And again, that's something your coach can help you with. But as a coach myself, I have a whole recommendation packet that I work with my clients on, because it is really important to give your recommenders exactly what you're hoping to get out of them so that they can write you a strong letter that has all the examples, that touches on the things you want them to touch on. And so it would be similar with clients you feel like you have a good rapport with. And with that, we are 2 minutes over time. So thank you everyone for joining. I know for some of us it was lunch, for others it was very early or very late. So thanks for being part of this. And please, regard me as a resource. I'm happy to help. I love coaching. This is, something I'm really passionate about, because I feel like we should expand access for people who maybe didn't know the pathway to get into the MBA program of their dreams. So this is what I'm here for, what I enjoy doing. And with that, have a good, happy Halloween if you celebrate, or a good Diwali if you also celebrate that. Bye, everyone.